Hello and welcome back to segment 3 of Your Brilliant Brain and the Wild World of Work. And today we are going to be talking about the Department for Efficiency, also known as Steve Peters' computer. So let's first do a quick recap of where we got to last time around, mainly because we're going to layer this knowledge up using our new brain department today. So at the end of last time, we discovered that we've got two key brain departments operating in the same space at the same time, i.e. our heads, but that they both have differing imperatives, and therefore they both have differing versions of success. And that it's possible that at some points in our day, in our lives, they're both beautifully aligned. They both agree on what the right strategy is and the best way forward, because they are both, in fact, aiming for the same goal. But on more occasions than we might like to realize, that's actually not the case. They're misaligned, with the human brain wanting to try and achieve one set of goals, and perhaps that more instinctive, reactive chimp brain wanting to achieve something slightly different. And here is where, on occasion, we might discover that the dynamics of what's going on are rather more complex than we previously realized. And we also discovered that because that is the case, and because one of the biggest functions of the limbic brain is actually to keep us alive, to keep us safe, and yes, it dates all the way back to a point in our evolutionary history where that was the imperative, its lens is pretty much unchanged. It views the world around it as full of potential threat. And that rather, as we might like to think, that CEO us would always, of course, make the decisions about what we choose and what we do and when we do them, the reality was not quite that clear-cut. In fact, the reality was, on occasion, markedly different. That a lot of the time, especially when a threat is perceived, it's not the CEO that makes the decision at all. It is, in fact, the world of the limbic system and the chimp. And of course, if you remember, that chimp, just like a chimpanzee, much stronger and much faster than the average human being. It explains why, on occasion, we might do or say certain things in the heat of the moment that later on we reflect back on with our head in our hands, wondering what on earth went wrong, as CEO us comes back online and realizes that whatever was said or done has actually just made things worse. So we arrived at the point of asking, well, what does this all mean for all of us? And that the reality likely is that without some significant development for our CEO, significant development in the way of awareness, self-awareness, and strength and conditioning to allow our CEO to handle more situations more of the time, it's very, very likely that we flit from human to chimp at multiple points during our day. Sometimes maybe momentarily, that momentary annoyance, that kind of thing. But sometimes maybe for a good deal longer. Maybe the cloud might hang over us for hours, if not days. And when we are in that more limbic space, the chimp is, if you like, in the driving seat, we may discover that we display behaviors and take actions that actually our CEO wouldn't necessarily approve of, but they're going to have to deal with them anyway once the red mist has parted and the human is back in control. And that one of the most challenging things for us to wrap our heads around as individuals is the fact that sometimes our CEO isn't even informed, doesn't even realize something's gone awry until far, far later on, by which time, of course, something less than optimal may have occurred. So I left you with a little bit of a teaser at the end of last time, and I said, there is a brain department that can help us here, and I want to introduce you to it. Because yes, we can do a whole lot of work around taming chimps, and no one is better at explaining that than Steve Peters. So if you're interested, I really would encourage you to grab a copy of The Chimp Paradox and get stuck in, because he's got so many different ideas about how best to recognize and manage that chimp. But from my point of view, where things start getting really exciting is where we introduce the world of the computer. Because it's the computer that both the human and the chimp will check in with first if they're not quite sure what they should do. So it's the computer that offers us another way of supporting our CEO development and also perhaps soothing and easing that chimp. So come on, let's have a look. So I'm calling this the database, the Department for Efficiency, because that's actually what its job is, but it is referencing Steve Peters' concept of the computer. And another useful way of thinking about it is to view it as your own personal book. It's almost like it's a rule book, a guidebook, an encyclopedia of life, full of information that's there to guide you through your day-to-day. Now, all of this guiding has one simple governing principle, and that actually is around efficiency. So the role of this database is to make things easier for the brain. It's to allow quick action, both in case of an emergency, so there's an actual physical threat, also, of course, as we now know, an environmental or emotional threat, but also it's there to streamline and take some of the weight out of the work of the frontal lobes, out of the prefrontal cortex's inbox, if you like, freeing up space for human us to do all that amazing stuff that we need to do, you know, like thinking and deciding and problem solving and getting along with other folks, all of that amazing stuff. Now, we've spoken before about the amount of energy that takes. And so part of the role of the computer is to refine what it knows so that it can run algorithms and autopilots. So if you think of an algorithm as if this, then that, what your computer has stowed is lines and lines and lines, and I suspect there would probably be millions of them, of algorithmics, if this, then that guide us through our lives. If someone does this, then it means that. If this happens, then it means that. You should do this. That kind of idea. But stowed in there as well, we also have loads of autopilots. We call them habits and habit loops. And habit loops that stick together, making complex autopilots that allow us to do wonderful things like drive cars, once we've learned how to do that, without really having to think about every single thing we need to do to drive the car. In fact, if you've been driving for a long time and someone was to ask you how you drive a car or how you got from A to B, you might very well discover you find that actually quite hard to answer because it's so beautifully autopiloted. You don't even think about it anymore. The CEO isn't really even aware of what is going on in there. And therefore, if required, it would be quite difficult to explain. So, the computer, an amazing piece of kit, absolutely epic amounts of storage, lightning fast, does its job really, really well. And as you can see down the right-hand side of the screen, there are some of its tasks. So energy conservation, information storage, but it's also responsible for lightning fast situational interpretation. So what is going on here and what does that mean, for want of a better way of putting it? And creating autopilots and algorithms around what it learns. It's an advisor, as I said, to the chimp, and it's also an advisor to the human. So it is of vital importance to us on our journey to discovering more about ourselves at work. So as we did before, let's have a look at its annual review. I think we'd have to say that this particular department is overall smashing it. It would certainly think it's smashing it, especially with its huge capacity, its lightning fast speeds, and the fact that it can operate autonomously. It just gets on with it. It doesn't really require any input from anywhere else. Once it's learned something, it's going to deliver against that reliably, time and time again. It's really good at giving us an experience to knowledge transfer. So it takes stuff on board, it makes sense of it, and then it tells us what that means. So therefore, it's also an interpreter and a guide. It's extracting meaning from the environment around it and helping it make sense to us, because that is what's going to guide us. Is that a good thing? Is it not a good thing? The computer is absolutely involved in helping us interpret what's happening around us so that we know what we should be doing next. It's also got stored away things like our value systems, our worldview, and of course, hidden behind my head, what that's saying is it helps support us in terms of our expectations around our roles, what we should be doing, our behaviours, our contributions, and also what others should be doing too. Now, if we were to take a look at this from a more CEO perspective, we might, however, note that even though the department itself is smashing it, there are nonetheless a few areas of concern. And these really are of interest to us, especially as we begin to go through the program, because some of what is in that computer is of dubious quality, shall we say. And there's a really good reason for this, is when we were born, our brain began to start learning about the environment that it was in. And if you like, that computer started getting programmed. But if you'll remember back to the previous segment, I mentioned that the initial programmer for the computer was not the human part of the brain. That takes years to begin to develop, up to 3 to 4 years before the human part of the brain, the frontal lobes, are at the point where they can really be programming that computer. No. The first programmer of our computer was in fact a little baby chimp, like baby chimp us, 1, 2, 3-year-old us. That was the person responsible for programming that computer in the early days. And understandably, that very young brain sometimes misinterpreted the information that it was taking on board. It made 1 and 1 make 6, for example. But if 1 and 1 made 6 too many times, that information would have been stored in the computer as a fact, as a thing, as a rule. So therefore, for each and every one of us, it's highly likely that alongside all the absolutely brilliant algorithms and rules and autopilots that we've also got some bugs in the system. And Steve Peters talks brilliantly about these, especially 2 particularly problematic bugs, ones that he calls goblins and ones that he calls gremlins. What he means by goblins is big errors in code that are big, hefty belief systems that are quite often very, very disruptive and unhelpful, especially for us. They might be around our worthiness or our abilities or what we are or not entitled to in the world we find ourselves in, all acquired from when we were very, very young and maybe neither accurate nor useful to us. But it's also collected a lot of belief systems that will have been, if you like, transferred culturally by our parents, by our teachers, by religious leaders, if we have religious upbringings, that sort of thing. Some of those may reflect outdated beliefs. Societies move, religious beliefs adjust, and cultural viewpoints change quite considerably. So some of what might be stored in there as correct may be highly outdated. On top of that, we've got coding biases, we've got coding errors, we've got all sorts of things that may have got into that computer that aren't entirely accurate. The problem here being this, that once something has gone into that computer, it will be treating it as accurate. It will be giving us advice from a database that is in error that it doesn't realize is in error. So sometimes it's telling us stuff is true, when actually that's not the case. It's a perception, it's an opinion, it's not a truth. But the computer doesn't work like that. It needs to work in terms of truths, if you like, because that's what allows it to reliably operate at such speed. That is just the first indicator of why working here can be so beneficial to us, and how sometimes, however amazing that computer is, there can be a few challenges that CEO us would be very well advised to make themselves aware of so that they can decide what they'd like to happen next. So if our CEO is going to benefit hugely from becoming more involved and getting more curious about what's going on in the computer, Where should it start? Well, here it's probably a good idea to just have some concept as to the most interesting areas, for want of a better way of putting it, to tune into. And you can choose all of these. You could choose one of these as a place to get started. I am going to put some more info about that into the additional resources that come with this recording. But what's going to be really useful for your CEO as it begins to get itself up to speed about some of the info that might be stored in the computer without it knowing is to begin to think about some of its key roles, some of the key areas that it is providing information about. So for some, that might be an interesting place to explore in terms of beliefs and worldview. In other words, your perception or what you understand to be true about how things are. Now, everyone tends to do this slightly differently, with some people liking to go really profound, like what's the meaning of life, which for a great number of people provides a huge amount of meaning that they then are able to take down a couple of layers and live their lives by. But for others, that's a bit too deep dive and they've got a different way of doing it. So it doesn't matter how you'd like to do it. What you're looking to try and explore is your computer's understanding of how things are. How is the world? What's that all about? And you're just looking to begin to ask some of those questions for yourself. What do I believe is true here? What do I believe is true about how things are in the world or in life in general? Whatever is stowed away there helps give you the concept of what being alive, what living your life is all about. And the next layer down from that information is key in terms of the computer then extrapolating out, if you like, what we are perhaps a lot more familiar with, and that's things like our value system. So our value system is, if you like, almost the rule book of what is right, what is wrong, what is good, what is bad, what should I be doing, what shouldn't I be doing, in order to be aligned with what I believe to be true according to my value system. And that in turn will be according to be true to my belief system and my world view. So that's how they kind of cascade. So we're much more familiar with the concept of values, especially because a lot of organizations will have their values splashed all over the place, telling us who they are and what they stand for. That's the purpose of values, and it's much the same for us. Humans like to operate consistently with their belief systems, consistently with their value systems. It's just that we're not often very used to stopping and thinking what they actually are. Sometimes it can be easier to spot what they are not. And here you might notice that when you feel that one of your values, something you hold very deeply to be true and important, is not upheld by another person or a group of other people. So one of the most interesting, exciting is not the right word, interesting examples to use here is very, very simple, is around things like timekeeping. So for some people, timekeeping is very important, and it's not just important because they think timekeeping is important. It's important because it means something. For those who value timekeeping, it's usually attached to a value system that is talking about things like respect, professionalism, things like reliability, that sort of thing. So timekeeping, if you like, is something that they would use as evidence of something like professionalism or respect or anything else for that matter. And therefore it's almost like a marker. It's a behavioral marker that's about something far more profound. The value system here is about respect, and timekeeping, if you like, is a behavior that belongs with it. Fabulous when other people around it are adhering by the same rule and they also hold timekeeping as an important marker of an important value. Not so helpful when someone else has a different value system that perhaps views timekeeping differently. Now, the behavioral expectations are not aligned, and think for yourself what might happen, especially if timekeeping or something equivalent is valuable to you. That's the power of the rule book, if you like, around our value systems. And then there's mindset, which I like to think of as a bit of a blend of worldview, beliefs and values, but it's more about the way we kind of go through our day to day and interpret the events that are happening around us moment by moment, but also our capabilities, what we can and should be doing as a result. So one of the easiest mindset beliefs to get a hold of would be your belief around your capability to learn new stuff, for example, or your capabilities to do certain things. What you believe to be true here, whether it's accurate or not, factually, doesn't really matter. If you believe you can't do something, then the chances are you will experience not being able to do that. If you believe that you're not a good presenter, or you're not very good at meeting new people, then the chances are that's the belief as you go into those situations. So that's exactly what's going to happen. And you're most assuredly, your brain will be paying close attention to evidence that further backs that up to keep that belief system intact, if you like. So our mindset, what we believe to be true about our abilities, our capabilities, and so on as we go through our day, largely shaped by our values and our worldview and our experiences. And it pretty much determines the way we will approach the stuff that's going to happen in our world. So these are some really interesting places to begin to explore from a CEO perspective, just to discover what's the computer got tucked away in there. Remember, there's going to be a huge volume. So you're just looking to, if you like, just take a peek and work with what feels comfortable and interesting to you. So very quick recap before we begin to wrap up for today. What does all that we've covered actually mean if we're looking to make it very, very simple? And the bottom line here is this, that whilst it is undeniably an incredibly helpful piece of kit, it is awesome in terms of its capability and the amount of streamlining it does for us. Our computer does also have a few bits and pieces that also cause us issues and challenges. Some of the programming that we have in there is not necessarily particularly helpful to us, either because it's no longer relevant or because it was miscoded in the first place. And either way, that is likely to cause issues and challenges for us right here, right now, in our day-to-day, in our lives in general, but also in our working lives. Of course, without awareness, we wouldn't know that actually we are in fact using that programming each and every day. And so if there's something unhelpful in there, we might be using that each and every day. It might be colouring what we believe we're capable of each and every day. We might be interpreting that as an absolute truth. That doesn't mean that that's what it is. It's simply what the computer believes to be true. And there, I suppose, is the glimmer of hope. There is why I get so excited about this particular part of our brain. And it's why a huge proportion of my work will involve supporting clients as they do their own work in this space. Because if we can better understand what's in there, if we can better recognize where perhaps some of those belief systems and programs are not beneficial to us, they are not helping us, we can actually reprogram the computer. We can make tweaks, we can make edits, we can retrain it, we can encourage it perhaps to not rely quite so heavily on some of those big, deep belief systems that are actually hugely, hugely unhelpful. There is so much room for growth here in this space. And it's growth that's going to both involve and empower CEO us. It's also growth that, if we do it well, is going to help provide an environment that wraps around our chimp that feels less threatening, less like we need protecting, and more like we can actually start to breathe and thrive. So, if you want to get started, here's where you might want to begin to tease apart some of what's in that computer. As I said, I have got some additional thoughts in these spaces in the resource pack that comes with this particular recording. So you might want to dig into some of those to tease this out for yourself a little bit further. Don't worry if you don't have the time for that. We're also going to be doing that as we begin to move into the rest of the program, because we are going to be looking at how beliefs and worldview, values and perspectives turn into things called expectations, and the meanings that we apply when our expectations are not met. Because here is so often where something will make our chimp feel threatened. When our expectations are not aligned with the reality we find ourselves in, we can be pretty sure we're likely to experience that with the limbic brain and have a response to it. So understanding a little bit more is absolutely what we are going to be doing as we work through the program. So fear not, if you don't have time, don't worry about it. We will get there anyway. So next week, we are going to be taking our human, our chimp, and our computer into the world of work for the very first time. So if you haven't signed up for that one and you're wanting to join the live sessions, please do. If you're just following along on demand, that content will be ready for you as soon as we have recorded it. Just one quick note about that resource pack if you want to use it. There we go. Some of the stuff that's going to be in there for you, you can just find that further down in the Academy space. Just go check it out. I'd encourage you here to maybe just work through one little bit at a time and start with the bit that just feels most interesting and right for you. So that's all for this time around. I hope you found that helpful. Please do continue following along, sharing with your friends. And of course, if you're a fan of socials, it'd be fabulous if you could give us a shout out if you're enjoying the program. But for now, we'll say goodbye and see you next time.